Alright, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to talk about the concept of path closeness, right? So you can probably get a pretty good idea of what that is or what that's about based on the title. But if you recall from chapter 10, we talked about the concept of subject closeness, right? So that's basically the idea, even though we went over it 100 times already. But just real quick, that's basically the idea that you could focus on subject B and access the subconscious memory associated with subject A, right? And the more similarly subject B appears to be the subject A from the perspective of your subconscious, the greater the degree to which you're able to access subconscious A memory while focused on subject B, right? So we went over that already, but that same principle basically applies to subconscious paths, right? Which makes sense, right? Subconscious paths are just subconscious memories. It's a set of subconscious memories that are ordered. So there's ordered in terms of a number, like this is memory 1, memory 2, memory 3. Each subconscious memory has a corresponding ordered set of subjects or categories. So they're going to obviously share a lot of the same properties. But with subconscious paths, though, there is a concept of closeness that is we actually didn't go over, right? So we can kind of get away without really talking about it when it came to charging emotions, but for performance, we have to talk about it, right? So to go over this first point, subconscious paths also experience a quality of closeness, both in subject and activity, right? So we obviously went over the subject, but the activity is kind of the new part, right? We didn't really go over that. So there's subconscious paths actually demonstrate a quality of subject closeness, but they also demonstrate a quality of activity closeness, right? So we're going to talk about what activity closeness is in a moment. But just to go over this next point, subconscious memory also stores information about, actually put two abouts there, but subconscious memory also stores information about the activity in addition to the subject. And what I really meant to say was that the parameter that determines when a subconscious path is accessed or called is part of that parameter is the subject or the category, which we already spoke about for any subconscious memory, right, for emotion. But the other parameter is activity, right, which we actually didn't talk about that much. So a subconscious path is also called based on the activity you're engaging in. Now we could kind of ignore that whole component of accessing a subconscious memory, right, when we were talking about charging emotion, because the activity was always the same. It was just telling some story in your mind. So we could kind of ignore it, right? And we really just talked about accessing subconscious memories based on the subject or category that you focused on. But when it comes to subconscious paths, right, you access the path based on two parameters, right? The subject or category, but also the activity. So we're going to kind of go over both of those in a little bit, but I want to just go over this next point, because I think this next point comes up an idea that I think is a very common misunderstanding about the way performance works, right, from a subconscious perspective. So go over this point, transcendental performance is accessed in a scalable way based on the subject or category and activity, and it's not accessed universally. So like I said, I'll talk about the activity in a moment. But one thing I feel like when I started to learn more about the way transcendental performance works, right, I was studying all of this stuff like crazy, and I was learning more and more things and developing the theory more and more. But one thing I kind of learned that I don't think I truly realized, but I definitely think is a common misunderstanding, is this idea that performance is universal, right? This idea that if you're really good at something, you're always going to be good at something in every environment and for every type of person you focus on. That actually isn't true, right? So in the same way, I can charge the love emotion, right, and it's accessed when I focus on a specific girl. Not every girl, right, unless it's a category. Like I said, it doesn't really make sense to charge that emotion as a category, but usually it's charged relative to a specific subject. So only when I focus on that subject do I feel that emotion very, very strongly, right? The same thing is true with transcendental performance. It is perfectly possible to charge your subconscious to perform well in a way where it's only accessible when you focus on a particular subject or person. Well, a particular subject or category. And a good example of that, and you've probably experienced this in your life, has to do with transcendental performance related to conversation, right? There are some people sometimes you can be really good, maybe even in the zone, right? With conversation when you're talking to a specific person, right? And then the moment you start talking to another person, it's like that energy goes away and you just can't hold a conversation as well, right? A lot of times that concept, we appeal to that concept when we use the term chemistry, right? When you just feel comfortable with someone, right? And you can just be yourself and you're just making conversation very easily. You're not even really talking about anything specific, right? You're just talking and it's just sort of coming out of you very easily and you're making interesting conversation. That's actually an example of a type of performance that's charged relative to a person, right? Or it can also be charged relative to a category, right? You can be very good at conversation when you're talking to a certain type of person. Let's say someone at work, right? And then when you talk to someone outside of work, maybe, that transcendental performance just doesn't carry over as well because the category is different. This is not the category the subconscious path is made up of, or it's not the subject the subconscious path is made up of, right? So you have to focus on the particular subject to access the subconscious path that's associated with your transcendental performance or category. Right, so I just think that's important. I kind of see that a lot. People always think if a person is really good at some type of performance, they can do it anywhere for any person in any environment. That's not true, because even the environment's kind of an extension of the subject. We're going to talk more about that though in the case of activity. But now, so actually, let's talk about what does it mean to have activity closeness, right? So that's actually important when it comes to transcendental performance. Well, just as it is possible to focus on a subject, right, or a minor subject, subject B, and access the subconscious path associated with subject A. Let me actually go over that here, because I kind of assumed it to be implicit, but let me just talk about it anyway. So in the case of subject closeness or category closeness, which there is such a thing too, for subconscious paths, right? If I charge it to be very good at conversation relative to a specific person, right? I could recall or access that same subconscious path while focusing on a different person, right? But the more similarly that person appears to my subconscious to be the subject A, the person I originally was charging the subconscious path for while focused on, then the more I'll be able to access that path, right? So the strength of the compulsion the strength of the compulsion of the subconscious path when I access it will be accessed on a scale, right? A scale. If the subject B looks a little bit like subject A, then I'll only feel that compulsion guiding me a little bit strongly, which means I won't be as easily able to perform transcendentally. If subject B looks a lot like subject A, then the compulsion I'll feel from the subconscious path that I charge while focused on A, I'll be able to access it very strongly, right? So it'll be very similar to when I'm focusing on subject A, right? And that can happen, for example, if you charge, let's say, some transcendental performance. Let's even say you're in boxing, right? And you charge your subconscious to perform transcendentally in boxing while focusing on a specific opponent. That's your rival. You fight them all the time, right? And you manage to charge a transcendental performance charge while focusing on them, right? Well, if you fight another opponent, let's say they look similar from the perspective of your subconscious, even if they might look different to the conscious mind, but let's say their height's the same, their style's the same, they have the same sort of mannerisms in fighting, maybe they're trained by they have the same trainer. To your subconscious, they might look very similar, right? And so your subconscious would access the subconscious path that's normally associated with that person, with subject A, or the first boxer. So that's possible. I actually did this one time when I was when I was practicing all of this, right? I charged my subconscious to be good at telling jokes, but I kept focusing on one person to charge it. And then I kind of realized when I focused on that person and just started talking to them, I would access all of that charge and I could talk transcendentally. But whenever I focused on anyone else, I couldn't access it as much, right? And that's actually when I first realized that was possible, which is actually consistent with the whole theory. So now I want to talk about activity closeness. So a subconscious path will be called or accessed depending on the subject or category you focus on and how similar what you're focusing on is to a subject, a previous subject or category, but it will also be accessed based on the activity or how similar the activity you're performing or you're focused on is to the original activity that you were performing while you performed the subconscious path. So that would be almost like activity A, right? So, yeah, if I focus on if I just find myself in activity B, right? So I charge the subconscious path for activity A, and I find myself randomly in activity B, it's actually possible for me to start feeling some of those compulsions that will guide my performance while I was focused on activity A in the past, right? So a good example of that I give here has to do with conversation, right? So that's the one I use because that's the one I used to practice a lot. So let's say I charge my subconscious to be a good conversationalist, right? But I charge that while I keep charging that while I'm actually talking to someone in person, verbally, right? And that it actually becomes a category. So now I can talk to pretty much anybody, right? As long as I'm talking to them in person verbally, I can access that transcendental performance charge. Now let's say instead of talking to someone verbally, now I'm talking to them on the phone, right? Does that charge still carry over? Excuse me. Well, the answer is it actually just really depends on the subconscious, right? So if I'm talking to them on the phone, that activity probably doesn't look as much like the activity of talking to them in person to my subconscious mind. So guess what? The subconscious path that helps me to perform well isn't accessed as much. I feel it a little bit and it does help with my performance a little bit, but not as much as when I'm actually just talking to someone in person. And it gets even worse if I start chatting with them or texting them, right? That activity looks very different from the activity of holding a conversation with them in person verbally, right? Even though technically to the conscious mind, they might look very similar, right? I'm just holding a conversation, we're communicating. To the conscious mind, it looks almost the same, right? But to the subconscious, it looks completely different. And it looks so different, right, that I might not be able to access almost any of my transcendental performance charge related to conversation. I'll probably be able to access some, right? So this is something I've experienced, but not as much, just not as much. It doesn't flow as much, right? At least that's what it feels like. So in other words, the activity of chatting or texting is so different from the activity of speaking in person that I'm not able to fully recall the subconscious path that helps me perform. So in that case, this person I'm talking to, right, they might notice that I'm really good in conversation while talking to them in person, and then all of a sudden, when they're texting me, I'm not as good at conversation. Why? That's because of the activity closeness, right? So the parameters that determine when your subconscious path is accessed, which that's what helps you perform transcendentally, those parameters are determined both by subject and category and by the activity. So that's very important. If I charge my subconscious to be really good at, let's say I charge it to be really good at making music. So this is actually another thing that happened to me. This is another example of activity closeness, but I'll just say it because it just popped in my head. So when I used to make beats, right, I would make beats on my computer, and my sort of, everyone kind of has their workflow or their creative process for how they come up with music. So mine was probably very common or basic. I would just set up my instruments on FL Studio, and I would just play certain notes, and I want to see what notes make me feel something, right? So I think I talked about that a little bit earlier in one of the earlier chapters. I'd play notes, see what makes me feel something. I'm actually really checking what sequence of notes my subconscious is very volatile towards, right? So I'm constantly focusing on, we'll talk about, this will make a little more sense when we talk about transcendental creativity, but I'm constantly trying to focus on a particular emotion. So I want my music to capture a certain feeling. So I'll focus on feeling a certain emotion, right? That makes my subconscious a little bit volatile at that frequency. Then I want to play notes that really get me to feel that emotion, right? And so what I used to do, I would just constantly, like I said, pick a synth or an instrument, play notes, see how I feel. But sometimes it's hard to use your fingers. You know, the better a musician you are, the better you are at this, right? I'm not that good. So it would sometimes be hard to like get into a certain mood or play certain notes, right? So I'm limited Any music that I can hear in my mind or what I can feel, I'm limited by my fingers, right, and by the synths. So I thought one time, I'm like, okay, I'm just going to hear a sound in my head, because a lot of times, and if you make music, you know what I'm talking about, right? Because this I believe this happens to every musician, right? Even though I don't know, I consider myself a musician. I'm more of an enthusiast, but still, this happens to musicians. When you're just hearing stuff, walking down the street and things like that, you might hear a sound, and then that kind of inspires you in a way. We talked a little bit about inspiration in chapter 7. That it might inspire you to just produce a kind of a new sound in your head. It could be that same sound, but it could also be a new sound. And then you're playing notes in your mind, and you like it. You're like, okay, that's a magnificent melody. But now you've got to try to find a synth or find an instrument on your in your music making program. For me, it's FL Studio. You got to find an instrument to kind of copy that sound as best you can, which is not too hard. But sometimes I would hear a melody that's just perfect. But now I gotta put it on my FL Studio, and I gotta find the right tempo for it. I gotta find the right synth that matches it, right? Because the melody will have a certain spacing, or it be at a certain tempo. Maybe it's 2 bars, or maybe it's 4 bars. You can't just pick any random tempo to sort of make the melody. So I gotta find the right one. So I was like, you know what? I can do it so easily in my mind. I'm just gonna make music in my mind, and then sort of put it on the put it into the FL Studio. And when I did that, right, it was true I could make music very easily in my mind, but it was so hard, right, to sort of get that music into FL Studio. Now, why? It's because I was creating in an activity that looked very different to my subconscious from the activity of just making music on my keyboard, right? So that's an example of activity closeness. My creativity completely dropped, right, the moment I tried to change the activity from what I was being creative in, right, which was just focusing on sounds in my mind. So after that, I was just like, no, let me just try to go back to making music using my keyboard, because that's I'm always going to be in that position when making music, right? It's going to be too hard. And it is possible to charge creativity there, while making music on my keyboard and just making it in my head. And I believe that's also what good musicians do, but it's going to take too much of a charge, right? We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But yeah, that's another example of activity closeness. But what I really wanted to say was just that, let's say I charge some kind of transcendental performance charge, right? If I charge it while focused on subject A during activity A, then it's possible for me to access that same performance charge if I focus on subject B, but I'm still doing activity A, right? Or I can focus on subject A, but now I'm in activity B, right? So if activity B looks a little bit like activity A, but not that much, but the subject is the same, then I might still carry some of the charge, but maybe not as much, right? So as an example, let's say I charge it to talk to someone at work, right? So the activity is talking in person at work, and the subject is, this person I'm talking about. Now let's say that I'm talking to that same person, maybe on the phone later, right? Now I might not have as good a charge, right? But it's the same person though, so some of the charge still carries over, but maybe not as much. But the activity, and it won't carry over as much because the activity is different. Or if I'm at work, right, and I'm talking to someone, in the same place at work, but now I'm not talking to the same person. So some of the charge might carry over, but maybe not as much, right? But all of it's gonna carry over when I focus on the same person and the same activity, right? So that's an example of activity closeness, right? So, yeah, I think we pretty much went over everything. I thought there was more to cover, but no, I think that's everything. So yeah, that's an example of that. That's basically what it means to have path closeness. So subconscious paths are basically close to each other, both in terms of their subject or categories that make them up, but also in terms of the activity. There was one other thing. Actually, yeah, there was another thing I forgot. So I actually want to now talk about a very good example of this, right? So there's actually an amazing example of this. And that had to do with fight, I think it was 2017, when Mayweather fought Conor McGregor, right? So like I said, I'm a huge boxing fan. And when I saw that fight, right, and you can watch the fight, I believe it's on YouTube, you'll notice something very interesting happening with McGregor, right? So, if you don't know, that was a crossover fight. Floyd Mayweather Jr. is a boxer, right? He's a pro boxer, and Conor McGregor is a pro MMA fighter. Generally, I think he started training in boxing more. He got interested in it, but his natural sort of thing is being an MMA fighter, right? So what ended up happening is they had a crossover fight in boxing, and so Floyd Mayweather is he's in his home field, but Conor McGregor, he's kind of doing something different, right? So he's used to MMA, but he's fighting Floyd Mayweather on his home turf or his home field in boxing. And what happened was very interesting. During that fight, you would constantly see McGregor try to get behind him, right? Like, why is he trying to get behind him? That doesn't give you an advantage in boxing, right? You can't hit behind the head or hit them in the back, right? It doesn't do anything, right? The referee's just going to stop the fight, or you'll lose points for hitting someone in your back, and then he'll bring you back to the front. But if you notice, he keeps trying. He can't help himself. When he gets in certain positions, he just tries to get behind him. And then he has to kind of catch himself or stop himself, right? Why is that happening? That's actually happening because of the concept of activity closeness, right? So the activity of boxing, it looks similarly enough to the activity of MMA that he was actually accessing subconscious paths. Well, we'll talk about multiple subconscious paths in the next video, but he was accessing subconscious paths associated with MMA while he was boxing, right? Now remember what I said. When you're boxing or when you're in a certain activity and you're accessing a subconscious path, that almost acts like a tell, right? So that's what I was saying before. And it's very difficult to resist the compulsion when your subconscious is compelling you towards some activity, right? For example, in boxing. And a fighter, it's going to be hard for them to constantly resist these urges all night while they're fighting, right? It's going to disallow them from performing well in a transcendental way. That won't necessarily say they're stuck or confined to a negative-minded or normal level of performance, but it's just going to be hard to constantly resist it, right? And that's a very good example. And sometimes it's hard to resist it, so he kept sort of giving into the urge, right? Whenever a subconscious path was accessed, and that urge sort of caused him to do certain things whenever he would see his opponent get into a certain position. So that was like the perception of the component in a certain position was the first category, or the category of the subconscious memory, the first subconscious memory associated with the subconscious path, right, is what I'm trying to say. So yeah, he kept sort of all night, right, he kept, when he would see his opponent, which is Floyd Mayweather, in a certain position, that was like the first category of the subconscious path, right, and he would feel the urge to follow the subconscious path, right, which is to get behind your opponent, and he just had to keep resisting it. So I just thought that was a really good example of activity closeness. So if you haven't seen it, you could watch it and you'll see what I'm saying. And so what he would want to do, so his subconscious memory, short-term memory, we'll talk about that a little later, but his subconscious has charged subconscious paths that are really good or ideal for MMA. And he has some paths that are also good for boxing. But occasionally, certain paths will be recalled for boxing because they look close enough, right? So yeah, I just wanted to go over that example. But yeah, that's it for path closeness. In the next video, we're going to talk about multiple subconscious paths and why that's really the more accurate view of this sort of framework as it relates to transcendental performance. All right, so yeah, that's it for now. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.